Grace Madison froze when her landlord Jackson Carter dropped a notice on the table announcing that her rent would double next month, or she would have to leave. He smiled at her, certain that a single mother would never dare push back against a man like him. Grace did not argue with him. She simply signed the receipt, folded the paper, and made one phone call. The next morning, Jackson walked outside and found lawyers, a banker, and a new ownership sign waiting on the sidewalk. The woman he had tried to force out had just bought the entire block. If you want to know exactly how Grace quietly pulled this off, stay with the story until the very end. The story opened on a Thursday afternoon in Maple Row, a historic stretch of Columbus, Ohio, lined with red brick storefronts, small family businesses, and apartments tucked above the shops. Grace Madison had lived in Unit 3B for nearly 6 years. The apartment was not luxurious, but it was the place she had chosen on purpose after her marriage ended. She earned enough to live somewhere far more expensive, yet Maple Row gave her something the glass towers downtown never could, a real sense of neighbors who knew her name. Jackson Carter arrived that afternoon with his building manager and handed Grace a formal notice. Her rent, the paper said, would increase by 78% once her current lease expired. Grace read the number twice, then set the paper down without a word. Jackson explained in a tone that was cold rather than apologetic that Maple Row was changing, that market values were rising fast, and that people who could no longer afford the neighborhood should find somewhere better suited to their budget. He added, almost proudly, that Maple Row was not a charity. Grace did not raise her voice. What unsettled Jackson far more than anger would have was how calm she remained. She asked him 3 specific questions: when exactly the new rate would begin, whether the increase applied to every unit under Carter Urban Properties, and which bank currently held the primary loan on the Maple Row portfolio. That final question made Jackson pause for half a second longer than he intended. He recovered quickly, forced a thin smile, and told her that was none of her business. Grace folded the notice and slipped it into her bag. She looked at him and said only, "Not yet." Jackson assumed it was simply a line meant to save face, the kind of thing people said when they had no real power to push back with. He turned and left the apartment feeling entirely satisfied with himself, already picturing the higher income figures he would show his lenders by the end of the quarter. Grace did not cry once the door closed behind him. She did not call a news outlet, and she did not post an angry rant online for strangers to see. She simply walked to the small desk by the window, the same desk where she had spent countless evenings after her daughter went to sleep, and sat down in front of her laptop. She opened a folder that had been sitting on her desktop for months, one labeled Maple Row Acquisition, Final Closing, and scanned through the documents she already knew by heart. It was the first clear signal to anyone watching closely that Jackson had just threatened the wrong tenant, in the wrong building, at exactly the wrong moment in his own finances. Outside her window, the streetlights of Maple Row flickered on one by one, illuminating the same brick facades Jackson believed he controlled completely. Grace thought about the bookstore 2 doors down, the shoe repair shop on the corner, and the dozens of families who had built their lives around this single stretch of pavement. None of them knew what she had been quietly building behind the scenes for the better part of a year and a half. That evening she called her attorney, Mason Reed, and said only one thing before hanging up. "Stop asking for extensions," she told him. "We closed the deal in the morning." The story rewound 18 months to understand how this moment had truly begun. Carter Urban Properties had once been a genuinely successful business. Jackson had purchased one building after another across Maple Row until his company controlled 26 of the 31 major properties in the neighborhood. He believed that owning nearly everything on the block meant he alone would decide what rent people paid and how the entire area would evolve. But Jackson had made one critical mistake. He had bought far too quickly, and he had bought almost entirely on borrowed money. When interest rates climbed and maintenance costs kept rising, the loans that once seemed manageable began to strangle Carter Urban Properties from the inside. Jackson was not on the edge of bankruptcy, not yet, but his company faced a severe liquidity problem that grew worse with every passing quarter, and refinancing deadlines were approaching fast. Grace had recognized the pattern long before Jackson ever handed her that rent notice. Her earlier career had involved evaluating distressed commercial real estate portfolios for institutional investors, work that trained her to read the warning signs most people missed entirely. All she had to do was watch how often Jackson cross-collateralized his buildings, stacking one loan against another, to understand exactly how trapped he had become. Rather than looking for a way to get even, Grace saw something far larger taking shape. Maple Row was slowly being turned into a machine built only to squeeze the highest possible rent from every tenant, with no regard for the community that had made the neighborhood worth investing in to begin with. So instead of simply defending her own lease, she began quietly building a plan to acquire the majority of the portfolio herself, long before Jackson ever pushed her toward a decision. She formed a company called Madison Community Holdings, combining her own savings, a commercial loan, and long-term investment partners willing to bet on stability rather than speculation. Mason Reed structured the legal framework from the very beginning, while Charlotte Hayes, who ran a community development fund, reviewed the portion of capital still needed to close the deal. No one in Maple Row knew that Grace stood behind the company. Even Jackson himself had never connected the name to the woman he saw walking her daughter to the bus stop each morning. It was worth noting that Grace could not have simply decided to buy an entire neighborhood overnight. The deal had been in motion for months, built through property appraisals, title searches, environmental reviews, insurance analysis, and a careful reading of every existing lease. Only one real obstacle remained standing in her way. Jackson had no intention of selling anything, not while he still believed he could turn the numbers around on his own terms. The bank holding his largest loan, however, was under no such obligation to wait for his optimism to pay off. Near the end of that stretch of preparation, Mason called Grace with news that changed everything. The bank had triggered a clause allowing it to sell off a group of loans and their underlying collateral after Carter Urban Properties tripped a financial covenant buried deep in its original agreement. Grace understood immediately that the door she had been quietly building toward for so long had finally swung open. The person Jackson truly needed to fear was never going to be Grace herself. It was the institution that had financed his ambition from the very beginning, and was now ready to walk away from him the moment the numbers stopped working in his favor. The financial pressure on Jackson only made him more aggressive. He needed to prove, ahead of an upcoming refinancing round, that the Maple Row buildings could generate far higher cash flow than they currently did. So the rent increase notices began going out across the neighborhood, one after another, with little warning and even less explanation offered to the people receiving them. A small shoe repair shop received a notice raising its rent by 40%. A beloved old bookstore that had operated on the same corner for decades received one raising its rent by 55%. Dozens of apartment leases were hit just as hard the moment renewal season arrived. Grace slowly realized this had stopped being a story about her own apartment a long time ago, and had become something that touched nearly every family and every small business on the block. Even so, the narrative never turned Grace into someone giving passionate speeches on street corners. She kept operating the way she always had, through careful strategy and hard numbers rather than public confrontation. She gathered vacancy rates building by building. She pulled maintenance costs, income statements, and mortgage documents. She traced every cross-collateralized loan and noted which balloon payments were coming due soonest, building a complete financial map of a portfolio that was quietly falling apart behind its polished exterior. What Grace discovered was the most serious problem of all. Jackson was raising rents largely to disguise the fact that the portfolio's real cash flow could no longer comfortably meet certain obligations owed to his lenders. The rent increases were not a sign of strength. They were a scramble to paper over weakness before anyone with real financial expertise noticed the cracks running through the entire operation. Charlotte still had not fully committed her fund's capital to the plan. She warned Grace directly that buying a distressed asset was one thing, but attempting to rescue an entire struggling neighborhood was something else entirely, with far greater risk attached to every dollar involved. Grace did not respond with an emotional appeal. Instead, she brought Charlotte a complete financial model, built from months of research, showing exactly how the numbers could work without repeating Jackson's mistakes. Keeping long-term tenants reduced vacancy costs significantly over time. Offering small businesses longer lease terms reduced turnover and the expenses that came with constantly finding new tenants. Renovating the properties in careful phases rather than pushing everyone out at once preserved steady cash flow throughout the transition period. Grace proved, line by line, that a less aggressive approach could still deliver strong and sustainable returns for every investor involved. Charlotte slowly began to come around to the plan, though she still had questions that needed answers before she would sign anything. Meanwhile, word reached Jackson that a mysterious company was attempting to buy up the debt tied to Maple Row. He had someone look into it immediately, unwilling to be caught off guard by a competitor he did not recognize. The only name his investigator ever turned up was Madison Community Holdings, and it never once occurred to him that the word Madison had anything to do with the woman renting Unit 3B. Furious that someone was circling his territory without his knowledge, Jackson made a decision that would end up costing him everything. He decided to push the weakest tenants out of Maple Row as quickly as legally possible, hoping to lock in higher paper income before anyone could interfere with his plans. Grace Madison, he decided without a shred of hesitation, would be at the very top of that list. The story returned to the moment right before the opening scene, the confrontation that had set everything else in motion. Jackson went to see Grace in person, already convinced that her earlier pushback on a smaller increase had encouraged other tenants to start questioning him as well. He wanted to make an example out of her, someone visible enough that word would spread quickly through the rest of Maple Row. He gave her a simple choice: accept the new rent when her lease expired, or move out entirely once the term ended. Grace asked if there was any room to negotiate the terms. Jackson told her flatly that there was not. Then, driven by his own overconfidence, he made the mistake that would ultimately unravel everything he had built. He told her that within a few months, all of Maple Row would have entirely different tenants living and working there. Grace understood immediately what that meant. Jackson intended to inflate the portfolio's paper income as fast as possible, hoping to convince a new lender to step in before his current bank could act on the covenant it had already triggered. She asked him quietly whether he was certain he still had a few months to spare. Jackson laughed at the question, assuming she was simply trying to sound more informed than she actually was. He even mocked her professional background, telling her that reading a few spreadsheets did not make anyone an expert in real estate, and that she should leave the serious decisions to people who actually understood the business. This was the moment the audience felt the deepest sense of injustice on her behalf, yet Grace remained completely composed through all of it. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten him. She gave no hint whatsoever of who she really was or what she had already set in motion behind the scenes. She simply signed to confirm she had received the notice and thanked him for stopping by. Jackson left the building feeling triumphant, already imagining the higher figures he would present to his new lender within the week. He had no idea that the woman he had just dismissed so easily held more leverage over his company than every banker he had ever negotiated with in his career. The moment the door closed, Grace called Mason. He told her that the bank had approved Madison Community Holdings' final offer, with all 3 remaining conditions now fully satisfied. Charlotte had signed off on her portion of the capital that same afternoon. Every piece of financing was finally in place, and only one decision remained in front of Grace. She could close the deal on Monday, following the original timeline they had planned for weeks. Or she could invoke the early closing clause built into the agreement and finish everything by Friday morning instead. Grace looked down at the rent increase notice still sitting on her kitchen table, the ink barely dry. She told Mason simply, tomorrow morning. It was not a decision driven by anger. Grace explained that she now had direct proof Jackson intended to keep pressuring tenants throughout any additional delay, and there was no longer any reason to wait for a more convenient date. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the final signatures would transfer control of nearly all of Maple Row into her hands, whether Jackson Carter was ready for that reality or not. By roughly 8:15 the next morning, Jackson arrived at Maple Row and immediately sensed something was wrong. A bank sedan sat parked directly in front of the management office. 2 attorneys walked in ahead of him. Mason Reed was already inside. A representative from a title insurance company followed close behind, carrying a thick folder of documents under one arm. Jackson stormed into the office and demanded to know exactly what was happening. The bank representative explained calmly that the transfer of the collateral portfolio had officially closed, in accordance with a restructuring agreement that Carter Urban Properties' own legal counsel had been notified about days earlier. Jackson stared at him, insisting there had to be some mistake. He had been told the buyer was some anonymous fund, nothing more specific than that. Mason set the closing documents on the table in front of him. The purchaser, the page read plainly, was Madison Community Holdings, LLC. Jackson still could not place the name, his mind racing through every investor he had ever met, every fund he had ever heard mentioned in passing conversation at industry events. Then the door opened. Grace walked in wearing the same simple work clothes she always wore, carrying the same worn bag she carried every single day. There was no evening gown, no waiting car outside, and no security detail trailing behind her. Jackson looked at her, then looked back down at the documents on the table, his expression slowly shifting from confusion towards something closer to disbelief. Grace said only "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Mason explained the structure of the transaction in clear, unhurried terms. Madison Community Holdings had acquired the primary loan tied to the portfolio and simultaneously completed the transfer of 26 properties across Maple Row once the underlying financial conditions had officially been triggered days earlier. Grace held the controlling stake in the new ownership group. Charlotte and the remaining investors had supplied the rest of the capital needed to close. This was not a case of Grace suddenly buying an entire neighborhood overnight through some miracle of good fortune. The night before had simply been the moment she gave the order to finalize a deal that had been carefully prepared for the better part of a year and a half. Jackson stood completely still, unable to form a coherent response for what felt like a full minute. Finally, he managed one question. "What about your apartment?" he asked. Grace looked at him steadily. "It belongs to my company now," she said. Mason added quietly that the very office they were standing in belonged to her company as well, along with every lease, every maintenance contract, and every management agreement tied to the properties Jackson thought he still controlled. It was only then that Jackson realized the full scope of what had happened. His own management contract, the one governing his role overseeing daily operations across the portfolio, had been included in the very same package of assets that had just changed hands that morning. The man who believed he was about to force a tenant out of her home had instead handed over control of his entire operation without ever realizing what he was signing away. Outside the window, a small crew was already replacing the sign above the management office door, though neither Jackson nor Grace paid it much attention in that moment. Mason quietly gathered the remaining paperwork into a single folder while the bank representative and the title agent exchanged a brief, professional nod before stepping outside. None of them looked triumphant. This was, after all, simply the closing of a transaction that had been months in the making, executed with the same careful precision Grace applied to everything she touched. Jackson finally sat down in the chair across from Mason, the same chair he had once used to interview prospective tenants for units he no longer owned. He looked at Grace one more time, searching her face for some sign of satisfaction or gloating, but found none. She was not there to celebrate. She was there because the paperwork required her signature, and because 6 years of quiet patience had finally reached its conclusion on a Friday morning in early autumn. Jackson's shock quickly curdled into anger. He accused Grace of deceiving him, of hiding behind the appearance of an ordinary tenant while secretly plotting against him the entire time. Grace answered with something remarkably simple. She had never once told him she was poor. She had never once told him she did not understand real estate. Every assumption he had made about her came entirely from his own mind, shaped by nothing more than the fact that she was a tenant and a single mother in a building he happened to own. This was an important distinction, one that kept the story from tipping into an unbelievable fantasy about a secretly wealthy heroine hiding in plain sight. Grace was not a billionaire. She was a highly capable professional who had combined her own savings, bank financing, and outside investment to gain control of a major transaction, the same tools any serious investor might use under the right circumstances. Jackson demanded to know what would happen to him now that the properties belonged to someone else entirely. Part of him likely expected her to throw him out onto the street immediately, mirroring the exact treatment he had planned for her only weeks earlier. But Grace did not do that. This was the second major reversal of audience expectation in the entire story, and it mattered because it revealed exactly who Grace was underneath the calm exterior she had maintained throughout. She told him plainly that every legal, existing agreement would be honored in full. She had no interest in using her new authority to settle a personal score against one man. However, every rent increase that had not yet taken effect would now be reviewed from the ground up before moving forward. Any plans to push long-standing shops out of the neighborhood were suspended immediately, effective that same morning. Grace also ordered an independent audit covering maintenance fees, security deposits, and a number of additional charges the previous management company had collected from tenants over the years. Jackson scoffed, telling her she would run the business into the ground within a single year if she insisted on trying to play the role of a generous savior instead of a sinister. Grace handed him the financial model she had built months earlier, the same one that had ultimately convinced Charlotte to join the deal. He read through it carefully. Lower target vacancy rates, reduced marketing expenses over time, Longer average tenant cycles across the portfolio, renovations grouped into manageable phases rather than rushed all at once. Commercial lease terms extending 5 to 7 years instead of 1. Jackson slowly realized that what Grace had built was not charity dressed up as business. It was an entirely different business strategy, built for durability rather than short-term extraction. Grace was not planning to offer free rent to anyone. She intended to generate real profit without constantly forcing people out of their homes and storefronts to do it. For what seemed like the very first time in the conversation, Jackson had no clever response ready. Mason then handed him a second envelope, one that was not an eviction notice at all, but rather a formal notice ending his role as property manager once the standard transition period outlined in his contract had concluded. Jackson still held some personal assets outside of Maple Row, but the small empire he had spent years building on this particular stretch of Columbus was finished for good. News of the sale spread quickly through Maple Row. Tenants struggled to understand how Grace Madison, a woman they regularly saw waiting in line at the corner coffee shop, was suddenly listed as the owner behind the company that now controlled most of the neighborhood. Grace organized a meeting for tenants and shop owners, choosing the community room above the old bookstore rather than any grand venue that might have signaled a different kind of leader entirely. There was no elaborate stage and no rousing speech designed to cast her as some kind of hero. Instead, Grace laid out 3 clear principles for everyone in the room. First, every existing lease would continue to be honored exactly as written. Second, she could not promise rent would never rise again, because that simply was not realistic for any property owner operating in a normal market. Third, any future increase would be tied directly to real costs, actual market conditions, and a transparent plan for reinvestment that tenants could review for themselves. One shop owner raised her hand and asked a pointed question. If Grace was also an investor, how could anyone be certain she would not become just like Jackson a few years down the road? It was a fair question, and Grace did not try to dodge it. She told the room plainly that they should not simply trust her, because she said the right words in a meeting. Trust, she said, had to be earned through actions that could be verified over time. Instead of asking for blind faith, Grace announced an independent audit process and a set of clear standards the company would be required to follow going forward, standards that any tenant could request to review at any point. This response made her a stronger character precisely because she refused to ask people to believe in her unconditionally. Charlotte also reminded Grace privately that the plan still carried real risk, and that risk did not disappear simply because the closing had gone smoothly. Several roofs across the portfolio needed significant repair. 2 aging heating and cooling systems required full replacement before winter set in. 1 row of buildings carried a stubbornly high vacancy rate that would need careful attention to fix. Grace understood she now had to prove something far more difficult than simply acquiring the properties. She had to prove she could actually operate them well over the long run, month after month, without the mistakes Jackson had made. Jackson, meanwhile, had not disappeared from the picture entirely. He began contacting several of Grace's own investors directly, trying to convince them that Maple Row was headed toward a financial disaster under her leadership. One of those calls reached Charlotte personally. Rather than hiding the conversation from Grace or handling it quietly on her own, Charlotte forwarded every detail straight to Mason the same afternoon it happened. A new source of tension had emerged that neither Grace nor her team had fully anticipated. Jackson had lost the neighborhood itself, but he still had enough lingering credibility in certain circles to make Grace's financing feel less secure than it had only days earlier. Before long, one of the larger outside investors backing the second phase of planned renovations called to say they were considering pulling out of the project entirely. Grace now faced a genuine test of everything she had built. If the investor walked away, she would still control the portfolio outright, but the renovation plan she had promised tenants might end up underfunded before it ever truly began. Jackson, sensing an opening, showed up at her office with an unexpected proposal of his own. He offered to use his remaining industry connections to help her raise the missing capital, on the condition that she sell part of Maple Row back to him within 2 years. Grace refused without hesitation. Jackson told her she was letting emotion cloud her judgment as a businesswoman. Grace calmly turned the accusation back on him, pointing out that his real mistake had always been assuming the highest possible rent automatically meant the most valuable property, a belief that had cost him nearly everything he once owned. She and Charlotte sat down together and restructured the renovation timeline from the ground up rather than searching for a replacement investor. Instead of renovating every building at once, they split the work into 3 distinct phases. Safety-related repairs and essential infrastructure came first, ahead of anything purely cosmetic. Aesthetic improvements, the kind that mattered less to a lender evaluating risk, were pushed back to a later stage of the project. Grace brought fresh occupancy figures and a stack of long-term lease agreements to the bank, using real numbers to rebuild the confidence her financing needed to move forward. The most important detail turned out to be this. The very tenants Jackson had once tried so hard to force out became the exact reason the bank trusted Grace's projected cash flow going forward. The financing was saved without a single outside rescue from anyone connected to Jackson. He was left to absorb the most painful realization of the entire ordeal. Grace had not won simply because she had access to more money than he did. She had won because she understood the true value of a property in a way he had apparently forgotten somewhere along the road to expansion. A building was never just brick, land, and a monthly rent figure written on a spreadsheet. Real value also lived in the ability to keep tenants stable, loyal, and willing to renew their leases year after year without constant turnover eating into the returns. Mason completed the independent audit not long after the financing issue was resolved. A handful of improperly assessed fees turned up in the records, and those amounts were quietly refunded to the tenants who had been overcharged under the previous management. Grace insisted every issue be handled strictly according to the law, without exaggerating anything into a criminal accusation the evidence simply did not support. It was a decision that kept the entire story grounded in reality rather than melodrama. Jackson eventually cleared out his last belongings from the Maple Row management office for good. Grace happened to run into him outside on the sidewalk as he was leaving. He asked her directly whether she felt satisfied watching him lose everything he had built. Grace considered the question for a moment before answering. "You have not lost everything," she told him. "You only lost the right to decide who deserves to live here." 6 months passed. Maple Row did not transform into paradise overnight, and the story never pretended otherwise. Scaffolding still covered a handful of buildings. The sound of drills and hammers echoed down certain blocks most mornings. Budget meetings continued week after week, sometimes running longer than anyone would have preferred. A few rents were adjusted slightly upward as leases came up for renewal, exactly as Grace had told the room she could not promise otherwise. But the vacancy rate across the portfolio had dropped noticeably since the sale closed. 3 shops that had once been preparing to shut their doors for good instead signed long-term leases, choosing to stay and grow alongside the changes happening around them. The essential renovations, the roofs and heating systems that mattered most, were completed ahead of the original schedule Grace had presented to her investors months earlier. Charlotte brought Grace the latest quarterly report during one of their regular meetings. The portfolio was performing better than even the most cautious projection they had built together during the early planning stages. This mattered more than anything else in the entire story because it proved that Grace had not simply won a single emotional confrontation with a difficult man. Her underlying business model actually worked, month after month, under real market conditions. Jackson happened to walk through Maple Row again one afternoon, months after everything had settled into its new rhythm. He looked up and saw the new sign hanging outside the first building he had ever purchased in the neighborhood. It read simply, "Managed by Madison Community Holdings." Grace happened to step outside the same building at almost that exact moment, carrying a folder of paperwork under one arm. There was no crowd gathered to mock him, and nobody bowed their head in reverence toward Grace either. It was simply 2 people who had once stood on opposite sides of a single piece of paper, standing on the same sidewalk months later with far less at stake between them. Jackson admitted, almost grudgingly, that he still believed she had overpaid for the entire portfolio. Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said, and left it there. He asked her why she still lived in her old apartment now that she controlled the entire portfolio surrounding it. Grace answered honestly. She had never lived there because she lacked the money to leave, she told him. She had lived there because it was where she wanted to be, long before anyone handed her a rent increase notice that changed the shape of an entire neighborhood. That answer finally helped Jackson understand the very first mistake he had made, months before any of this began. He had mistaken her simplicity for weakness, when in reality it had never meant anything of the sort. Jackson turned and walked away down the block. He was not fully redeemed by the end of the story, but he was not reduced to a cartoonish villain either, simply a man who had finally run out of assumptions to lean on. The story closed roughly a year after that first confrontation over a rent increase notice. Grace still worked out of a small office right in Maple Row instead of moving her growing company into some polished tower downtown. Madison Community Holdings had since acquired a few additional smaller properties nearby, but Grace deliberately refused to expand too quickly. She had watched Jackson's own downfall unfold up close, and she had no intention of repeating the ambition that had ultimately cost him everything. Mason liked to tease her, saying she had become the strangest kind of property owner in the entire city, one who still called maintenance herself whenever a faucet in her own unit started leaking. Grace laughed and told him at least now she finally knew exactly who to call. Her daughter was mentioned only briefly near the very end of the story, a quiet detail showing that Grace shut her laptop on time each evening so she could go home. A reminder that building an empire had never actually been her real goal in the first place. Charlotte sent over the full first-year report not long after that conversation. Maple Row was profitable. The vacancy rate remained low across nearly every building in the portfolio. Property values throughout the neighborhood had climbed steadily since the sale closed, and tenants who had once feared losing their homes were now signing renewal after renewal without hesitation. There was no need for any dramatic final act of revenge to close out the story, because none of that had ever really been the point. Grace walked down the same street where, a year earlier, Jackson had told her that people who could not afford Maple Row anymore should simply find somewhere else to live. Now she noticed a small sign posted outside the very first building in the portfolio, reading simply, "Property owner, Madison Community Holdings." She paused there for a few seconds, just taking it in quietly before continuing on her way home for the evening. A year earlier she had been nothing more than the single mother renting Unit 3B in Jackson Carter's eyes, someone he assumed he could push aside without a second thought. What he never understood was that real power does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit, driving a luxury car, or sitting behind the desk of a corner office on the top floor of some downtown tower. Sometimes the person who looks the least powerful in the room is simply the one quietly waiting for the right moment to sign the final piece of paper. Jackson Carter had raised the rent hoping to force Grace Madison out of Maple Row for good. But by the very next morning, it was Jackson himself who had lost his place at the top, standing on a sidewalk he no longer controlled, in a neighborhood that had quietly slipped out of his hands while he was still congratulating himself on a decision he believed had already been won.